Welcome to the fifth episode of Zabaani. This is a podcast event brought to you by the Statesmanship Program. We at Zabaani plan to bring to you atypical topics in an unconventional manner. This week, we talk about the education system, the flaws in it, and the challenges that it faces, and the current reforms that have been brought around. I am Mehul Joshi, an editor at the Statesmanship Program. I'm a first year economics student from Mumbai. With me today here is Yashika.
Hello everyone, I'm Yashika Singla and I'm a 12th grader from Zyder School for Excellence and I am a volunteer at Statesmanship Program.
So, as you've seen, today we'll be having two people who are in the education system talk about how the education system works. So, before we begin, Yashika, do you have anything for us? Like, would you
Uh,
like to say anything?
so basically, I think the topic today is very relevant to all of our lives given that we're at a stage where we are actually experiencing what education system is like, which reminds me of a sentence I read in my sociology textbook which said, school is a place which evaluates and assesses individuals with a socially accepted yardstick, a focus on the word socially. And that is where in lockdown I decided to retrospect and introspect about how for these 12 or 13 years, how much has school been poignant in building up what I am. And as a disclaimer, if any of educators have taught me or might be teaching me, listen to this podcast, this is just a manifestation of frustration. I do not intend to offend any individual. I have immense respect for them. So yeah, so I mean, school is a place from where we actually started to learn about the world after family. I mean, the cliche school is our second home thing. So I think it is very much necessary that we talk about what are the shortcomings in this specific sector.
Yes, so, like I couldn't agree more. I think it's important to realize that when you point out the flaws in the education system, you're not pointing fingers at educators because they themselves are a part of a system which is inherently flawed and that it has had its own achievements, but then there's a lot we need to address as well. So let's start off and let's talk about how there is this entire system of rote learning in schools. Like we're talking about teachers, right? There's literally a song called Rattamar. So I mean, there is this. In we as a society have somehow made it like when you say education, it somehow has become synonymous to mugging up facts and just blurting them out. So, like Yashika, what do you think about this? Given that you're in school right now.
So basically, the kind of curriculum we have, I am a humanities student with subjective topics which we learn, but yet our evaluation of knowledge about those subjects is very much objective, which is in terms of marks rather than knowledge or understanding. So when it comes to abiding by a certain set of points from which we have to write question, students have no choice but to resort to rote learning because they cannot write any points which is outside their syllabus scope as they defined it or the textbook prescribed points. So it is very convenient for people to not research and go in depth because they have this specific set of 5 sentences which they have to mug up, write an exam, get marks, and then they flourish in the career apparently from that. So I mean this is a very toxic and rigid sort of learning pattern because we are just that is very theoretical. There's no practical application of that knowledge we have learned. I mean, we can talk about the statistics of how many rapes happen in India every day, but there's no point mugging up the stats when we are not working to stop that thing from happening in our societies. I mean, rote learning is a very outdated concept, and I think at this point it is one of the major drawback of education system because those people who cannot mug up and who cannot memorize stuff, they often fall back in class, fall back in marks, and they do not get into good universities or get good admission, which actually is not very valid when it comes to measuring the socially accepted success yardstick.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree on all the points there. Like, as an art student myself, like, I started from commerce and, like, now I'm doing arts. And trust me, both the places, it's just the same thing. People are just mugging it up. And I think you rightly brought up how, we've made everything what's socially acceptable. Education isn't supposed to be socially acceptable, it's supposed to change the social mindset. It has to be framed in a manner that makes people question the status quo. If education continues to uphold what is socially acceptable, the society would never progress. And as you said, like admission, so like we are seeing colleges in the Delhi University declare cutoffs as high as 100%, and then that makes you realize how are people going to get marks that high. And the thing is that not everyone is capable of mugging up, and not just because everybody is framed differently, but there's something called learning disorders well existing, right? That also brings me to another thing that I've been thinking about, how mental health, learning disorders, like even if you say that schools have become accepting to children with learning disorders, it's just those very few kids who have the privilege of having parents who are ready to get their kids diagnosed and get proper treatments. But then there's like thousands of kids out there who have dyslexia and a lot of other learning disorders which never get diagnosed because their parents themselves are so hesitant. And not just that, like in general, people with anxiety, people who are suffering from depression, schools just turn a blind eye to it. It's the bahana maar rahe hain, as they would say. So how do you look at it, Yashika?
I mean, we saw this very amazing movie called Tare Zameen Pe, which talked about dyslexia, which is the first movie to actually introduce the concept of dyslexia to Indian society. And we saw that people with learning disabilities, most of the time, they are ignored as mischievous hai, masti kar raha hai. They do not actually try to understand what is the reason of that behavior. And from my personal experience, it has happened many times. Maybe some of my peer friend is having a panic attack or they're feeling choked, and we literally have to disguise it with the excuse of a stomach ache or headache, because it is very uncomfortable for us to approach our teachers and talk to them about our problems. I mean, when you go into school, you're spending 7 hours there. Maybe somewhere at some point of time there might be issues which a student is going through, which he or she cannot talk about. I think there's a lack of empathy in this kind of school environment we have. And even talking about psychology curriculum, we talk about anxiety, right? And I recall it very vividly in my textbook. I mean, measures to be taken when a person is getting anxious. Go and talk to an elder. I mean, this is a kind of learning we are having, where we are trying to prevent anxiety by talking to elders, which is extremely disheartening, because this is not something a feasible and a pragmatic practical solution which lies. So yes, I mean, mental health is something which something not even educators or students are accepting, and there's a lot of stigma in education system, whereas education system is the one who's supposed to remove the stigma around this topic.
Yeah, I mean, exactly like you already said, how education is something that's made, like now education has become something wherein you're testing people on their socially acceptable, tendencies. And moreover, this entire thing that, it's something different, that this ostracization of mental health in general, that, people with anxiety, people with depression are somehow different, that, that even people like you and me, like we could have anxiety and it wouldn't show on our faces. It's not written on someone's face that this person is going through something in life. So I think this general stigma that we've, and this entire gaslighting that is perpetrated by the system, that that somehow they believe that हमने कर लिया तो तुम क्यों नहीं कर सकते, and this attitude that somehow somebody else's problems are always inferior to somebody else's struggles. I think that entire system that we have put into place is just extremely toxic in its existence.
I mean, the basic place where we can see the lack of mental health in education system is rising suicide rates of student. I mean, if our education system were so aware about our mental health, I think those numbers would have not been as high as they are. So in total, mental health is a place, I say, where education system has failed, because we have discrimination in our school, which actually manifests itself into some sort of hidden depression, which teachers do not unintentionally realize, or even students do not realize. When the bullying culture goes on in school, they do not realize how much traumatizing it can get for somebody. And apparently with the entering of virtual learning, at this point of time, Zoom, Google Meet classes, and that they have brought in a lot of change, and students are not ready to maybe adapt or accept the change. So I think schools need to realize that there needs to be bit of efforts taken to make the child understand, make the child adapt. They need to have interaction, the child increase communication and understand what the child is going through. There needs to be an individual attraction interaction with each and every child. Group sort of system, it does not work.
Yeah, exactly. Like now more than ever, you need people to be cautious about mental health because now the dynamics have changed. Like if you look at the entire thing, offline learning, there's still the scope of you can physically see the people in class. So although depression, anxiety, and these mental illnesses do not come with physical indicators always, but there is a sort of indication when people are little aloof, and there are signs which educators in general can identify because they're educated, they prepare about the thing. But now while we've shifted to online learning, people can easily have their cameras switched off and be sitting. And that also brings us to the point that forcing people to switch on their cameras, people with self-image issues, people with body image issues, forcing them to switch on this camera, this obsession with that, then burdening them with assignments. I guess you would know this better than anybody else, that how they've been burdening kids. Like, so tell us about it. Like, how has it been at school lately?
I mean, okay, again a disclaimer, but yes, we have had one of our subject teachers calling us shameless and characterless when the whole class didn't switch on camera, and it was very much intriguing, amusing, and at the same time very disappointing that someone who might has legitimate, like some of those are living in joint family, for them having small homes, small space, and switching off camera becomes very inaccessible because they might have grandparents around them or siblings around them. And apart from that, obviously, as you talked about self-image issues, some people are camera shy. And I mean, with all that, it is very weird that anyway, switching on the camera does not has any effect over how people are answering the class or how interactive they are. So switching on the camera is one thing I found really absurd, given that even there is a problem of lighting. The students has had to adjust his camera like 15-20 times to get the lighting right, and it becomes very chaotic. I mean, in the end, switching on the camera, and even people with network issues get kicked out of the Zoom meeting as soon as everyone starts to switch on their cameras. I think maybe teachers should realize ki it's not that children are not switching on the camera because they don't want to study. There are students who are not switching on the camera because of real reasons. I mean, obviously there's been a lot of nuisance in education, virtual education, with people Zoom crashing, playing songs, going offensive with the chat box, but at the same time their nuisance does not account for genuine problems some other student is facing.
I think it's really and like again, it brings us to the point that the system inherently is flawed, right? Because it's not the educators at fault always. Like we realize that there's this entire system of discrimination that is being perpetrated at our schools, and not just in our schools, it's the society in general. That women are, hurled abuses at, that it's just how, and it's not even for that matter at educators' fault, because they have grew up in this society which has, conditioned them to believe these things. And as far as it goes, talking about the entire other side, like a few days back, I had, a person just crash into our class and abuse the teacher. So in those cases, we've seen that, teacher, there is like the offenses are getting extremely serious, with explicit pornographic images being put forward somehow, with teachers getting abuses, death threats. Like that's the extent till which we've seen their own privacy being breached, because you have to like at the end of the day, they are also people who are sitting from their homes and trying their best to teach you. But then still there's just so much, uh, this entire system that we've created itself is so flawed, wherein even schools, administrations have been turning blind eyes to the problems of both their teachers and students.
Yeah, I mean, I think the primary uh, the primary drawback of education system is that we have glorified teachers as infallible human beings. We forget that teachers, their intellect, their opinions are guided by their experience and the kind of knowledge they have received. So under no utopian situation can you expect them to be both politically and socially correct, as well as have a neutral approach. I mean, there's a lot of role conflict that is in the school environment. I mean, the whole system is thriving on very contradicting chaos, and that is why most of us are so inefficient in practical domains of life and rationality. And I mean, because we have spent about 14 years in this whirlpool of confusion along with our educators, and that is why we all are very much non-substantial and not at all ready to actually understand what's our society and what's life like.
I think you brought up a really good point with respect to people having opinions, right? So it's but obvious that your teachers would have their own political opinions, so that kids will have opposing political opinions. That brings us to an important juncture in this conversation about politicization of education and how recently we saw the introduction of the national education new education policy 2020, wherein an entire set of reforms has been brought into place. So, and the government has tried. It has been it's a long standing procedure. It is historic in its nature, given that after a period of more than 20 years we have a new policy in place now. But then there has been substantial criticism of a lot of aspects. So how do you, as a person who's going to be directly affected by the NEP, respond to this?
Okay, so the thing is, NEP has this really good point about focusing on dealing with the learning crisis I have been facing, and it has its focus on the foundational literacy, and it is trying to move away from the rote-based rattamar and memory-based learning, and entering into the conceptual, analytical, and critical sort of thinking. But I mean, it looks quite good on paper, but the implementation of the same is a very ambiguous thing, because I mean, changing curriculum and removing the hierarchy of subject does not erases it from mind of people. I mean, in 21st century I still get calls from my relatives asking me why I chose humanities even when I scored decently in boards. I mean, just because on paper, on sheets we are writing, that will be eliminating um the glorification of objective evaluation and getting into holistic report cards. It does not imply that many parents will be out there who actually won't even go through the whole holistic report card and will just go and see what the subject marks are. And apart from that, there's this another point of uh, educators and teachers, for them also to adapt to this sudden reform. I don't think so. You can change a person's personality attributes in one or two training sessions which government provides. I think it is going to be hell of a ride. It's like a double-edged sword, and obviously for a great glorious cause, the sword is fighting a very long ongoing battle, but there surely is going to be some sort of blood that is going to spill on the ground, and that is something which is very much concerning. Ki how will the whole uh, system gradually shift from such rigid to such forward sort of thinking?
Yeah, makes complete sense, Yashaka, to be really honest. Like, education policy, like especially a new education policy, is something that in economics you'd call a prospective plan. That is something that goes on for a period of extended periods of more than 20 years, right? And the implement it is indeed a really, like, it sounds really good on paper, but then implementation of such policies goes beyond political parties. It because many a times, like if you see the previous policy itself, it spanned across not just the current ruling party but the previous ruling party's regime as well, right? And the next policy indeed has a possibility of the same. So in these situations, what becomes necessary is that there are a lot of concerns, as you've already brought up. The fact that you can't remove this inbuilt stigma in the heads of the people, right? Not just that, there's this entire fear about language imposition in general, something our country has been dealing with ever since its creation. That Hindi imposition has been a topic of great discussion. And I think like that's something that needs conversation between state governments to put forward their viewpoints. Like that is how you would go about a policy implementation, right?
Yes, I mean, for the language, even those students whose parents have a transferable job, it becomes very hard for them to, get. introduction to a regional language every 1 or 2 years. I mean, there are certain aspects on which there is lack of acknowledgement or the lack of announcement and lack of addressal too. So yeah.
Also, we came across this entire clause wherein there'll be peer reviewing. Like, you do not know how far it's going to fare out, but you can just have opinions and things at this point. But like the entire peer reviewing thing is also very flawed because people who are of introverted personalities, people who have learning disorders, people who have mental health disorders, people from the LGBTQ plus community, they are at more risk of being or like they do generally get ostracized and bullied by their classmates, right? And you wouldn't expect them to do well on a peer review. So that is why I think there's a lot to address, and we all can have faith. A healthy conversation is the only way to go hard. Like not blaming people isn't how you will go about a policy implementation. There needs to be a actual conversation between educators. We need to take in students. I think that's something that we're missing as a country, that we completely miss out on the people on whom you are going to put these policies. So that is something we
Exactly. I mean, for us, with the kind of aptitude and the skill development we had till now, the kind of knowledge had been given, adapting to this sudden skill based development from the kind of theoretical thing we have been studying, it can actually prove to be very stressful to some students who had this habit of mugging up everything and were doing brilliantly. For them, seeing a sudden fall in marks, maybe or not doing well in exams, it will actually not be, very much something which will make them happy. So they might be stressed, might the depression rates might pick up, nobody knows. So I think there is like a dire need of a public discourse on this topic, wherein students and teachers sit together and discuss about the future course of action.
Yeah, it does make complete sense. And I think the entire concept of a education policy works like that. You need to have a lot of discussion before it gets implemented. And that is why it takes so much time to just bring about one education policy. The only thing is like a conversation between two people who've just been in this system right now brought in so many flaws, inherent flaws that we as people who've gone through these systems have identified. And I think people as educators are in a better position to analyze it because they are, they're not just training one set of people, they're cross generational learners they've gone across. So I think there is a need that people, that the conversation itself becomes non-politicized, that it does not matter who brought in these policies. Now what matters is how can these policies and how can the policy implementation at large be made in such a manner that is beneficial to students. Which brings us to the another point that we are saying that there should be conversation, but people who are in the system itself do not know how to put forward their points. They like when you talk about public speaking, people do not have those capabilities. Something that we, when we started off with the statesmanship program, had in mind that to provide platform for all forms of public speaking. So it needs to be understood that NGOs like ours and a lot of other people are trying to do these changes. But as a person who's in school right now, how do you think that your that the schooling system can provide for better personality building in your school, or like in general in school?
I mean, I think when we talk about public speaking in particular, what happens in school is at a early age, some people they get on the stage, they get the opportunity and the support, and maybe they do have the confidence to get on the stage. And after that, it is just those 4 or 5 people who continue public speaking throughout the course of their life. While other people do not get the chance, or maybe because of insecurities they do not even try. I mean, I think there is we need an inclusive sort of system which actually makes it compulsory for everyone to get on the stage and speak, because communication is how you actually flourish in your future, because it is a part of being a social entity in this whole s- as a whole, as a social entity, you need to speak, you need to put forth your opinions. So I believe I mean, many times it happens even when in class, when the simple chapter recital, teachers often criticize the students' pronunciation instead of correcting it. And I think it becomes very toxic, and it actually leads to a lot of discouragement and demotivation in the students. So they just decide to not speak at all. I believe there should be completely abolished sort of ideology, and everyone should be actually forced upon space to go and put for their opinions. Another point which comes in there is school decide they try to be apolitical. They're like, till 12th be apolitical to any topic, any issue which is going in the country, and after 12, when you are turning 18, you can just go and vote on whatever you're learning in 2-3 months, or whatever you here is. I think schools do not need to take a definitive stand, but they need to make the students aware of what is happening in the country, and to have their students form their own healthy opinion set, because it is a youth which is going to take country forward. Having a youth unaware about what is happening about around them is actually something which is not good for our whole country, our whole economy. So yes,
I
that's
think I couldn't agree more, like on a lot of points, especially when you talk about public speaking. It's those same, and I have been one of those four people that you talked about who get those opportunities, and it's because it's good for you. Like I have had that opportunity, but I feel bad because people were, denied that opportunity from beginning itself. Like, and it's pretty toxic as a culture that we follow at schools, at generally in places. So I think you're very right on that. And as far as it goes with politics, I think politicization of education is wrong, but politics in education is wrong because education itself is political. How can you separate, like, when in schools itself we see women getting, indiscriminately affected by a lot of things. Something as simple as sanitary, facilities in a school, they indiscriminately have an impact on women than men. And not just that, the society in general, people who come from marginalized communities, there is racism in school, there is casteism in schools that we all have witnessed. Not just that, even people from, the LGBTQ plus community in schools, they face a horrible amount of oppression even in these spaces. And I think that's where trauma starts for a lot of people as well. And it wouldn't, I think schools don't need to say that this party is the best or this is the best ideology, but you need to let that conversation happen. You need to let your kids talk about those things. You need to let, like, for example, let them criticize the government, let them support the government. In either way, let that conversation happen in your school so that there is an exchange of ideas. And who knows, what comes out of that conversation. So I think, yeah, that there should be that discourse happening, that people, that kids need to get empathetic about each other. And I think if at an early stage you are letting people understand and, put forward opposing political opinions, they will be able to develop a basic understanding, a basic empathy of respecting each other's opinion. Something that I think now that we as a nation face a lot of problem with hate speech being so prevalent, that, people from all political, like every person across every like the political spectrum being so harsh on the people from any opposing views. So I think that's where we need to improve upon.
yeah, I mean, when we talk about politics, it does not actually limit itself to parties. It actually extends to several issues and problems which exist around us. I mean, as a sociology student, it was very much weird to see my classmates not knowing what CNRC was when it was introduced. And I mean, it is actually it is the kind of diversity we have. It leads to diversity in intellect and in knowledge consumption. It leads to a lot of imbalance in the education system amongst peers. I mean, schools actually need to put forth a platform for students to have their own logically and rational based opinions about the reality of life. We cannot forever live in this bubble of theoretical concepts wherein we do not know what actually goes down in real life besides the four wall of classroom we have.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, it's not just schools for that matter. Like, I am in first year of my college, and like as a person who's doing a B, like I am doing in BA, and I attend classes wherein people are talking about like the society at large. People are having political science classes, and then they do not have like they cannot analyze things such as CA and NRC. Like, you can oppose, you can support, but have an opinion at least. Like, what are we learning if you cannot put forward a simple opinion or a thing? Like, and especially sociology subjects like sociology, history, geography, like these people need to be way more aware. There needs to be conversation, and not just them, for that matter, people from STEM fields, from science in general. like they have this attitude that they are somehow separate, they don't need to have an opinion. Like, how does it make sense at all? I think it just reminds you that there is a lot you need to work upon, and that you need to, like, do you have anything that you think, how can the system be improved, something from your end? Like, how
I
do you
mean, I think the national education policy is the most welcoming thing which we can expect as an change in the education system. The kind of curriculum they'll be following, I mean, I'll be passing out in my school by that time, but I have a lot of hopes for my juniors and people who will be entering into the system, that they'll have better skills and better analytical and critical thinking than us, and maybe they'll be more intellectual and more aware about what goes down in our country or in the world at large. Apart from that, I think basic reform school can take up is just making children read newspaper in school, or maybe just reciting the news on a daily basis, which some schools do. But for that matter, most of the students very nonchalantly take it. They do not listen. They are engrossed somewhere else. They're having two-sided conversations in their head. So I think there's a dire need for educators to orient their students into this mold of what should be rather than what has been. So yeah, that's all I had to say.
Yeah, makes complete sense that make education relevant, that that these textbooks themselves are getting outdated now, that when you're teaching concepts, like when you're teaching something such as economic stabilization in your country, talk about how it's happening currently, like talk about how the current government is responding. Like, if not, you like don't take sides, but at least put forward the situation so that kids can have analyze it for themselves. With that, I guess we have tried our best. Like, we've as people who are the victims of the system, who've tried to put forward their opinion. In the second part, we have Mr. Sahil Nahar come in. He has his NGO and he's from Pune, and our teammate Kamya will be conversing with him, and hopefully we'll get to know like much more. And there's a lot that is in stock for the listeners of Zabaani. So stay tuned. We have for the part B of Zabaani. Until then, follow us on Instagram, the Statesmanship Program. Stay tuned. Do you have anything to add, Yashika? Like any final
No,
comments?
thank you everyone for bearing with our manifestation of our frustration, and that will be all. Stay tuned.
So thank you so much. Thank you for listening in. Stay tuned for the part B of this episode.